I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1728 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. I don't know about you, but I'm beginning to get the feeling that somebody's trying to put the shuck on us all. Putting the shuck on us is what the good old boys out in Texas use when they're trying to say somebody is pulling a con job on us. That has to do with the current big deal about the coronavirus. On this day of April the 26th, 2020, the whole world is going crazy over the coronavirus. We're being told that it's the end of the world. We're all going to die if we don't go into our house, lock the doors, and don't come out again. Shut down all the businesses. Ruin everything, because otherwise we'll all be dead. I was a little suspicious in the beginning, but as time goes on, I get even a little bit more suspicious that somebody's putting the big shuck on us all. That's because I realized that the Hong Kong Flue that hit us back in 1968 has become the Rodney Dangerfield of pandemics. If you remember, they had something going on back in 1968, right smack dab in the middle of the Vietnam War. That was known as the Hong Kong Flue. Around the world, more than 1 million people died from that flu. In this country, 100,000 people died. Back in those days, we only had a population of about 205 million people, and 100,000 people died. Today, about 50 or 60,000 people have died from the coronavirus, and we have a population of about 350 million or more. So I was thinking, if it was so bad back in 1968 with the Hong Kong Flue, why didn't they shut everything down then? They could have shut down Vietnam. They said that the Hong Kong Flue was spread to California because of Vietnam veterans returning home. They caught it in Vietnam and brought it home. We seemed to get through it just fine. Back in those days, if you got sick, you went to the doctor. He'd give you some aspirin and say, go home, stay in bed until it's over with in about a week or so. Today, if somebody tests positive for the coronavirus, all hell breaks loose. People just go crazy. That's why I think something fishy was going on, because when you look at the two big differences between these two pandemics, it really makes one wonder. Consider this. The Hong Kong Flue, guess what, started in Hong Kong from an avian virus, just like this one. It spread around the world, and everybody called it the Hong Kong Flue, and nobody was called a racist when they did that. They were merely stating the obvious. The flu came from Hong Kong, so it was known as the Hong Kong Flue. Today, if you call this coronavirus a China virus, people jump on you like you're the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. It's ridiculous. You're only stating the obvious. It came from China. Another big difference between now and the Hong Kong Flue back in 1968 was they didn't shut down the economy. Guess what? We just kept on going and everything worked out. After a while, it went away. Now, it did come back the next year. Same thing. We just took care of it. People got sick. They went to the doctor, got healed up. 100,000 Americans died, but guess what? Americans die all the time. Nobody lives forever. Most of those people who died were older people who were about ready to kick off anyway. That is two of the bigger reasons that make me think we're being given the shuck. As my good buddy, the late Sam Giesenslaw would say. And you know what? There's some other people out there who agree with me. One of them is Nathaniel Moir. Nathaniel Moir is a Ph.D. up there at Harvard University. He's an Ernest May postdoctoral fellow in history and policy and a member of the Applied History Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Can you imagine having to say that title more than once a day? It's a lot of work. He agrees with me and is asking a few of the same questions. He wrote a story titled, "Move Over Coronavirus, We Fought a Pandemic During the Vietnam War." Then his subtitle is, "Did We Learn to Write Lessons?" This story appeared on the National Interest website. I'm going to share the story with you, and then you can decide for yourself. Is somebody trying to put the shuck on us about the COVID-19 virus? Maybe so. Let's see what Nathaniel has to say. Dateline, Boston, Massachusetts. Again, the title of his story is "Move Over Coronavirus. We Fought a Pandemic During the Vietnam War." 2020 has been a rough year. 1968 was worse. Granted, as of late April, we are only a third of the way into this tumultuous and frustrating new decade. Unless the United States goes to war, loses important and mostly celebrated political and social leaders to assassination, and unless multiple riots and ensuing police brutality erupt at the National Convention in Milwaukee, 1968 may remain one of the low points in America's history since the end of World War II. Need more evidence? Many may recall that after Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King's assassinations, race riots devastated numerous communities in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Detroit, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive proved that there was no light at the end of the tunnel and that the war was getting worse in terms of human cost, with 16,899 troops killed in action in 1968 alone. Additionally, tens of thousands of more troops deployed to Southeast Asia than in 1967. Peak troop strength was over 540,000 by the end of April in 1968. On top of war abroad and extensive civil unrest at home, yet another big problem made life harder. In 1968, the H3N2 pandemic killed more individuals in the U.S. than the combined total number of American fatalities during both the Vietnam and Korean Wars. In almost all historical accounts of 1968, war and politics dominate. The H3N2 virus, in contrast, is literally nowhere to be found, especially in books focused on the Vietnam War. Globally, the 1968 pandemic, known as the Hong Kong Flue, killed over 1 million individuals and ended the United States with a 1968 total population of 205 million. The virus killed over 100,000 individuals. After studying the Vietnam War for almost 15 years, it is surprising that the 1968 pandemic is not even mentioned. In an attempt to avoid calling the kettle black, it took COVID-19 for this realization and a question to emerge. Considering the way COVID-19 has changed the course of 2020, one is left to wonder, why does the 1968 pandemic barely make an appearance in studies where American foreign policy has been scrutinized at length? If domestic politics played any role in America's war in Vietnam, why isn't the 1968 Hong Kong flu pandemic somewhere in the analytical mix? Simply put, why has this topic elided historians focusing on the Vietnam War? Unfortunately, war may have something to do with it. Despite calls for unity in the face of such seismic calamity as COVID-19, the disease does not unite Americas any more than war unites it. With the possible exception of World War II and from the American Revolution to today, war has rarely pulled the United States together. Much as the Vietnam War divided Americans, the response to COVID-19 appears to be doing the same. It is helpful to understand the magnitude of the 1968 H3N2 pandemic. How prevalent was it? Does it share characteristics with coronavirus? For starters, the 1968 virus was not simply the flu. By definition, pandemics result from the emergence of an influenza A virus that is novel for the human population. According to the Journal of Infectious Diseases, the AH3N2 virus emerged out of Hong Kong in July of 1968 and replaced an earlier virus, HH2N2, in circulation during the 1957 pandemic. In 1968, the virus spread rapidly from Hong Kong to the United States and then to Europe because of increased air travel across continents. In a manner similar to SARS, Ebola, avian flu, H1N1, and H3N2 in 1968, the surge of COVID-19 is only the most recent cost of globalization that has already been with us for decades. The first wave of the 1968 virus hit the United States especially hard, while asymptomatic infections and much lower mortality rates occurred in England, France, and other countries. Through a phenomenon vividly termed smoldering, a second wave in 1969 and 1970 increased infection and mortality rates in England and France than these countries experienced during the 1968 wave of H3N2. In the United States, the second wave of smoldering in 1969 and 70 was far less than what the British and French endured. To satisfy potential cynics, the Journal of Infectious Diseases 205 report explains that H3N2 was not simply the flu, but truly a novel virus subtype. Further, there was a 2-week delay between morbidity, contracting the virus, and mortality. This closely parallels similar patterns for COVID-19. Current reporting indicates that more Americans may die from COVID-19 than died in both the Vietnam and Korean wars. Let us hope that this turns out to be inaccurate. Yet, in histories assessing the Vietnam War, the 1968 pandemic inflicted far more damage in terms of human life than COVID-19, at least as late as April of 2020. In terms of histories touching on the 1968 pandemic, after reviewing at least a dozen of the most prominent histories of the Vietnam War, ranging from George Herring's The Longest War to A.J. Langus's Our Vietnam, not one book includes flu, influenza, H3N2, or even pandemic in its index. Granted, the number of COVID-19 deaths which are not precisely known far exceed those currently reported, and the economic cost appeared to be increasingly central to the 2020 pandemic. Still, it is remarkable that the 1968 pandemic does not even surface in well-respected studies of the Vietnam War. Was the 1968 pandemic of such little concern when compared to other events that it did really figure into American domestic politics, let alone those involving American foreign policy? Considering the complete dominance of COVID-19 in the news today as contrasted by the 1968 pandemic, why is 2020 so different? It is possible that the key difference between the 1968 pandemic and COVID-19 in 2020 is the ongoing economic devastation occurring within a majority of countries. The economic downturn and lasting consequences for small businesses and the service industry as an entire block are certainly more severe than most financial turmoil in the 1960s. Numerous reports point to the fact that it will take years for the United States to recover and that day-to-day business will not be the same as before, at least in major cities such as New York City. It is also expected that COVID-19 will change national security and how the United States assesses its readiness for potential defense and security-related crises, let alone public health readiness. It is difficult to substantiate claims that the world was not deeply interconnected in 1968. So is the need to shut down a majority of the global economy a reflection of greater aversion to personal risk. The fact that almost 50 years elapsed between the 1918 and the 1968 pandemics, and a little over 50 years have elapsed since 1968, suggests that a major virus may have the potential predictability of Halley's Comet. In any case, it would certainly be interesting to know in what ways the 1968 pandemic affected or did not affect policy decisions concerning the Vietnam War. And if it didn't, why not? Reflecting on pandemics more thoroughly in our histories might certainly help us realize that they should not be the black swans they seem to be. There are some who believe that the COVID crisis will change us. I hope they are right. Yet, if the 1968 pandemic was so invisible that it barely makes it into key books on the Vietnam War, it is hard to see how change will come about after COVID-19 eventually retreats. In much the same way that the Iraq War demonstrated our ability to forget lessons from the Vietnam War, the 1968 pandemic suggests we may eventually forget COVID-19 in a similar way. Not only does the general public forget, unfortunately, historians often forget history. That is the end of Nathaniel L. Moir's insightful piece on the connection with the pandemic we suffered during the Vietnam War and the coronavirus. The close to his article is a very true statement. I keep saying we need to remember the past so that we don't commit the same mistakes in the future, like getting involved in a war similar to the Vietnam situation. They never seem to learn. Nobody listens to the Ed Lansdales who know the truth about these situations and how to handle them. I just hope the historians in the future remember what we went through with this COVID-19 crisis. Why doesn't somebody sit down and compare the COVID-19 crisis with the Hong Kong Flue crisis of 1968 and make some rational decisions rather than trying to run and hide like a bunch of scared wussies and destroy the economy? Let's hope someone will step forward and correct the situation. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne, closing out episode 1728 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these presentations. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?